Okay, let's start. We just noticed now that the flyer was not so clear about what would to have been expected under the heading of opening. Um, um, it is to be expected a short talk of the director of the Institute. So, dear participants, guests, colleagues, friends, it is a great pleasure and definitely a real honor for me to have the opportunity and the responsibility to welcome you today to the Future in Critical Theory conference here at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. There are several reasons for having organized this conference and to dedicate it to the objective of envisioning in a collective intellectual effort the contours of a critical theory of our time. First of all, and perhaps most obviously, we are commemorating with this conference the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Institut für Sozialforschung, which for at least 4 decades can be said to have been the home of critical theory in capital letters, and which to this day is associated and in fact associates itself with the tradition of the so-called Frankfurt School. But there is a second institutional reason, admittedly much less noteworthy, for convening here for the next few days, and that is the fact that 2 years ago I took over the Institute's directorate. After having devoted the first year of the new administration almost exclusively to organizational tasks and the internal restructuring of the Institute, we spent much of the second year organizing an extensive and at times controversial internal process of identifying common ground and debating the guidelines for future research at the IFS. What began as a process of elaborating a research program for the next decade or so has resulted, if only provisionally, in a perspective paper that the Institute is now presenting to a wider audience on occasion of this meeting. You should have received the beautifully designed booklet with your registration, or you'll find it on the desk outside. And we hope that our thoughts and positions will resonate with you, whether positively or critically, over the coming days and at best well beyond this conference. But let us move on to the third and undoubtedly decisive reason for meeting here for the next 3 days, which is the alarming state of economic and ecological, political, social, and cultural affairs in, let's call it, latest, very latest, or perhaps the most appropriate term today, last capitalism. Choose your own personal horror characteristic of the current constellation: climate change or border regimes, neo-fascism or neocolonialism, you name it. A glance at the German newspapers over the recent weeks is enough to raise the crucial question: what the hell is going on here? According to the latest update of the Climate Action Tracker, Germany is far from meeting its own national policy targets and miles away from a fair share emissions record. If all countries followed the German path, the world would heat not by 1.5, but rather by 3 degrees by the year 2100. At one of the world's largest auto shows in Munich last week, the car industry claimed that individual mobility and 3-ton vehicles are part of the solution to sustainability problems rather than the problem itself, and hundreds of thousands of onlookers seemed to be buying the message. Germany's Social Democratic Interior Minister is working hard to establish stricter rules for the deportation of refugees who have been denied asylum, while the number of drownings in the Mediterranean this year has just passed the 2,000 mark. The Deputy Prime Minister of the state of Bavaria, confronted with this crude anti-Semitism in adolescent years, received broad popular support for his accusation that he is the victim of the political witch hunt. The right-wing candidate for Prime Minister in the state of Thuringia, who according to recent polls could win 1/3 of the vote in the next regional elections, announced that he would free schools from gender and inclusion ideologies as soon as he had the opportunity to do so, and so on and so forth. For anyone coming from the US or the UK, from France or Italy, Poland or Hungary, this may sound pretty familiar and almost unremarkable, part of the new normal of so-called democratic capitalism. But this is precisely what a critical theory of contemporary society should be concerned with: the creeping normalization of and growing public indifference to a capitalist formation that is relentlessly revealing its destructiveness and gradually throwing off its democratic shackles. It is this puzzle that should be a major driving force of critical social theory and research today. The indolence of at least considerable parts of the population in Western societies in the face of a social formation that creates wealth by means of destruction, that grants entitlements by way of exclusion, that concedes freedoms to some that have to be paid by others. How to explain the social acceptance of a formation whose viability and ability to survive from its beginnings to the present day is inevitably based on the annihilation of life? We will be discussing this mystery, which may turn out not to be so mysterious after all, in tomorrow's evening conversation, and I assume it will be addressed in other sessions of this conference as well. Mysterious or not, there is no doubt that the times in which we are living call for a critical analysis of their crises and contradictions, for a theory that attempts to bridge, at least to some extent, the distance to social practice. In those respects, the intellectual tradition on which the Institut für Sozialforschung is built and to which it is committed happens to be an asset and a burden at the same time. It is obviously an asset because Frankfurt-style critical theorizing is so incredibly rich and so inexhaustibly diverse that any emancipatory critique of contemporary society that did not draw on it would be self-defeating. And at least as far as the 20th century and post-World War II democratic capitalism are concerned, there was surely no other theoretical community as important and influential for leftist social movements as Adorno and Marcuse, Horkheim and Fromm were for the German and US student movements in the 1960s and 70s. At the same time, however, there can be no doubt that for an academic institution such as the IFS today, operating in a completely different political and social environment and under radically changed institutional conditions, it is a charge and a fetter to be compared to again and again and to be placed into a trans-historical comparison and competition with the Institute's former protagonists. Evidently, this is a no-win situation. And it is the result of a widespread image of the Institute as the intellectual and material creation of a handful of genius thinkers, as if there had not been tens or even hundreds of critical scientists, men and women alike, working with the big 2, 3, or 5, doing the day-to-day groundwork for them and keeping the organization going at all. The history and historiography of the IFS will be discussed in today's evening, this conversation, but it seems to me that an institution that wants to promote, if only by means of critical thinking, social emancipation today has to emancipate itself from the organizational model of academic knowledge production that was established in the late 19th century and was basically dominant not only in Germany, throughout the 20th. Having already mentioned the 2 evening sessions, let me give you a very brief overview of the conceptual idea behind this conference, which is divided into 4 sections. Under the heading of Dissecting Critical Theory, it will begin today with a critical inventory of critical theory's conceptual repertoire. Given the fundamental changes that capitalist society has undergone in the last 100 years, which concepts and perspectives need to be updated for the current conjuncture, which are timeless, and which have lost their analytical capacity? Tomorrow's 2 sections will reflect on 2 major challenges for critical theory today. One is to consistently globalize a theoretical tradition that for most of its history has taken a distinctly Euro-Atlantic perspective. We will ask about the theoretical, normative, and practical implications of decentering critical theory and about the contribution of non-Western epistemologies to such an enterprise. The other focus will be on materializing critical theory. What does it mean to put society's relations with nature at the center of critical theorizing? How do we respond to the theoretical challenges associated with the different versions of new and not so new materialisms? Finally, the last section, to be held on Friday, will be devoted to recomposing critical theory, in light of what has been dissected, revised, and amended before. Given the multiple crises and contradictions we are currently experiencing, do we need new answers in theory and practice, or do we even have to ask new questions in the first place? I'm very much looking forward to listening to the 31 speakers who have accepted our invitation to Frankfurt and to this conference. And I would like to thank them first for being here and for sharing their thoughts, their expertise, and their critical engagement with us. I would also like to thank our 5 keynote discussants and the 14 colleagues chairing the keynotes, panel sessions, and evening conversations. In terms of Thanksgiving, for their financial support of this event, I would like to thank the Goethe University and its president, Professor Enrico Schleif, the Society of Friends and Patrons of the Goethe University, the City of Frankfurt and its Head of Cultural Affairs, Dr. Ina Hartwig, and last but not least, the German Research Foundation, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. For technical and logistical support, thanks go to the event management services of the Goethe University and for the catering to the Studierendenwerk Frankfurt. The Medienkollektiv Frankfurt am Main will be filming the keynote presentations and evening conversations, which will then be accessible to a wider public on our YouTube channel after the conference. And Lena Hauptner has designed the whole range of conference materials, poster, flyer, website, booklet, and so on. Thank you. Finally, I'm deeply grateful for all the support in planning and organizing this event to all the colleagues at the Institute for Sozialforschung, especially to the members of the Institute's 100 Years Working Group, to the colleagues of the Institute's Collegium, to the scientific and administrative management of the IFS, Thomas Barth, Almut Poppinger, Sonja Schnitzler, and to Eva Fleischmann, Mirko Broll, and Miriam Schröder, who have been responsible for coordinating the event management and public relations activities around the conference. Special thanks go to all the research assistants you will see or not see in front of and behind the scenes over these 3 days, and in particular to Adam Jędrzejewski and Moritz Sohn for their invaluable organizational work over the last few months. Having said that, it is time to declare this conference open, but not without adding one substantial point. For many years now, there has been talk both in the public and the scientific discourse on climate change of the clock striking 5 to 12, 5 vor 12. A trope suggesting that there's definitely no more time to lose to change course, but that there is still a very last window of opportunity to open our eyes, make up our minds, and get a grip on the problem. However, you do not have to be a defeatist, just a critical theorist, to counter this strange rhetoric of hope and dramatization with the assertion that whether in relation to climate change or to any other structural problem, there is no such thing as 5 to 12 in terms of capitalist dynamics. In fact, what characterizes the social formation known as capitalism is the institutionalization of a 5 past 12 logic. It is too late, not only today, but it is always and has always been too late to save capitalism from itself and people from capitalism. The fact that capitalism is still alive is the catastrophe of our time. It is therefore time, as it has always been, to change the chronology. There is never time left to revolutionize the conditions It would always have been necessary to take action 10 minutes earlier. And yet, now is the moment to stop hesitating and to change direction. Critical theory and critical social research in Frankfurt, as elsewhere, should be among the intellectual drivers, or maybe more than that, should stand in the front row of this dynamic. Thank you very much, and enjoy the conference.